So I'm the final target for the day, and I seem to be well illuminated, though I can't see any of you, so it's kind of like facing a firing squad. Oh, sunglasses. Yeah, this is a no-win situation. I'm just going to stand like this, okay? So first, I just wanted to, once again, on behalf of, I think, everybody who's been participating in this, thank Chris and Annabelle for running a fabulous conference, the Fetzer Foundation for making this possible, Bob Pollack and the CSSR for making all of this happen. It's really been a terrific conference. I've learned a lot. I'm guessing that probably at least one other person may have learned a lot too. So thank you, all of you, for making this happen. So anyway, I'm going to talk about Buddhist ethics. And before I start, I wanted to give two other bits of personal thanks. And that's to Bob Thurman and Mark Sideritz, because I realize they're the two people I've learned the most about Buddhist ethics from. So if anything I say sounds vaguely familiar, I have shamelessly ripped them off. And the last thing I wanted to do is to apologize that I'm kind of at the tail end of an Indian cold. So if I start coughing, just direct all the compassion to other people in the audience, because trust me, it doesn't feel nearly as bad as it sounds. It'll be much worse for you than it will be for me. As Alan emphasized, very often in the Buddhist tradition, especially in the Tibetan tradition, we think of ethics as an important preliminary practice before attaining meditation, insight, and other realizations. But as Thupten Jinpa pointed out, we also think of ethics as the goal of practice. And so there's a sense in which we come full circle. We work our way up to ethics, as we've been doing in this workshop. But also, ethics forms the kind of foundation for any serious practice and any serious contemplation. So I have been also asked to say that assuming that we all attain ethical perfection this afternoon, we're going to re-begin the entire program immediately following this panel from scratch. They don't call it cyclic existence for nothing. I'm not going to read the whole paper. It's all available on the web. I'm going to be kind of jumping around in it and skipping parts in order to try to stay on schedule. So first part's called Ethics and Interdependence. There are two temptations to be resisted when approaching Buddhist moral theory. The first is to assimilate Buddhist ethics to some system of Western ethics, and that's usually done to some form of utilitarianism or some kind of virtue ethics. The second is to portray Buddhist ethical thought as constituting some grand system, resembling the systems of meta-ethics that populate Western philosophy. In Buddhist philosophical and religious literature, we do find many texts that address moral topics. However, we find very little direct attention to the articulation of sets of principles that determine which actions, states of character, or motives are morally virtuous or vicious, and no articulations of the kind of familiar sets of obligations and rights that we come to expect from Western ethical theory. This is not because Buddhist moral theorists were not sufficiently sophisticated to think about moral principles or the structure of ethical life. And it's not because Buddhist theorists think that ethics isn't important enough to do systematically. It's instead because, from a Buddhist perspective, there are simply too many dimensions of moral life and moral assessment to admit of clean moral theory. Buddhist ethical thought has instead been concerned with understanding how the actions of sentient beings are located, and to locate those beings within the web of dependent origination, or praticca-samutpada. This web of dependent origination is quite complex, and so there's a lot to be said, and so as a consequence, Buddhist ethicists have had a lot to say. But the web is also untidy, and so what Buddhists have had to say resists easy systematization. There's one last temptation to resist, and that's to see the various Buddhist philosophical and religious traditions as constituting a homogeneous whole. As many people have emphasized today, Buddhism's a really big place, and there's lots of stuff said, and we're not going to try to cover the entire ground. I'm going to confine my remarks to one strand of Buddhist moral thought, that beginning with the articulation of the Four Noble Truths at Sarnath and running through the anti-intellectual work of Nagarjuna in Ratnavali, of Chandrakirti in Madhyamaka and Shantideva in Bodhicharya Avatar. I've always been known as an anti-intellectual, and so thanks, Stephen. I hope I'm going to be able to show that this strand of Buddhist moral thought represents a reasonable alternative way of thinking about a moral life, one that can engage Western moral theory in a profitable dialogue by being close enough to be talking about the same subject matter, but by being different enough to actually have something to bring to the table on its own. Thinking about the good from a Buddhist perspective begins from the first principle of Buddhist metaphysics, the fact of thoroughgoing interdependence. Every event, every phenomenon is causally and constitutively dependent upon countless other events and phenomena, and in turn is part of the causal ancestries and constitutive bases of countless other phenomena. Moral reflection on action must take all of these dimensions of interdependence into account. To focus merely on motivation, or on character, or on the action itself, or on consequences, would be to ignore much that's important. Nagarjuna reminds us that to understand dependent origination is the same thing as to understand the Four Noble Truths. In Mulamajjhanaka Karakai famously says, whoever sees dependent arising also sees suffering, its arising, its cessation, as well as the path. I think Nagarjuna is right about that. The truth of suffering sets the problem that Buddhism sets out to solve. The universe is pervaded by suffering and the causes of suffering. The Buddha did not set out to prove this at Sarnath. He took it as a datum, one that is obvious to anyone on serious reflection, though one that escapes most of us most of the time, precisely because of our evasion of serious reflection in order not to face this fact. The Buddha also assumed that suffering is a bad thing. If you disagree with that assessment, then moral discourse doesn't have any basis. Sometimes I have students who say, well, maybe all this is suffering, but who cares? I like suffering. And my response is, well, then you don't need Buddhism. You don't have the problem that Buddhism is all about solving. But if you kind of agree that suffering is a bad thing, and if you think that on reflection there's a lot of it in the world, then you think that Buddhism has an interesting problem to solve. The Buddha then argued, popular bumper stickers and our vice president to the contrary notwithstanding, that suffering does not just happen. It arises as a consequence of actions conditioned by attachment and aversion, each of which in turn is engendered by confusion regarding the true nature of reality. Attention to the second noble truth allows us to begin to see how very different Buddhist moral thought is from most Western moral thought. The three roots of suffering are each regarded as moral defilements and are not seen as especially heterogeneous in character. None of them is seen as especially problematic in most Western moral theory. And indeed, the first two, attachment and aversion, are each valorized, at least to some context, in some systems. Think, for instance, of Aristotle in this regard. The third, confusion, is rarely seen in the West as a moral matter, unless it's in a context where one has a duty to be clear about something or other. But this is far from the way it's seen in Buddhist moral theory. Buddhism is about solving a problem. The problem is suffering. The three root vices are vices because they engender the problem. The problem is that the world is pervaded by unwanted suffering. The diagnosis sets the agenda for the solution. The third truth articulated at Sarnath is that because suffering depends upon confusion, attraction, and aversion, it can be eliminated by eliminating these causes. And the fourth, which starts getting ethics spelled out in a more determinate form, presents the path to that solution. The Eightfold Path is central to an articulation of the moral domain as it's seen in Buddhist theory, and careful attention to it reveals additional respects in which Buddhists develop ethics in a different way than do Western moral theorists. The Eightfold Path comprises a correct view, correct intention, correct speech, correct action, correct livelihood, correct mindfulness, and correct meditation. While many, following the traditional Tibetan classification of the three trainings, focus specifically on speech, action, and livelihood as the specifically ethical content of the path, in fact, that is much too narrow. The Eightfold Path identifies not a set of rights or duties, but a whole set of areas of concern, of dimensions of conduct. And the path, in all of its eightfold complexity, indicates the complexity of human moral life and the complexity of the sources of suffering. To lead a life conducive to the solution of the problem of suffering is to pay close heed to each of these many dimensions of conduct. Our views matter morally. It's not simply an epistemic fault to think that material goods guarantee happiness, that narrow self-interest is the most obvious rational motivation, or that women are incapable of rational thought. These views aren't just irrational, they're morally problematic. It's not only what we do that matters, but what we intend as well. Intention grounds action, even when it misfires, and it matters to us who we are, to who we are and to what we become, what we intend to do. And we could spell this out in detail for each of the 8 dimensions. The Eightfold Path, which represents the earliest foundation of Buddhist ethical thought, must always be thought of precisely as a path and not as a set of prescriptions. It indicates areas of concern, not specific duties. It does not involve a calculus of pleasure and pain. The account of the good is far more abstract, far more distant from sensation. Moreover, the doctrine's consequentialist only in a rather thin sense. I mean, Mark Sideritz has pointed out correctly there's something deeply consequentialist about Buddhist ethics, but it's not a kind of consequentialism that you find in Western ethics. It's a different version. The consequence that matters is liberation from suffering, not some particular set of mundane experiences. There's no boundary drawn in the Eightfold Path that circumscribes the ethical dimensions of life. There's no distinction between the obligatory, the permissible, and the forbidden. There's no distinction between the moral and the prudential, between the public and the private, between the self-regarding and the other-regarding. Instead, there's a broad indication of the complexity of the solution to this very deep problem of suffering. Part 2, Action Theory and Karma. The term karma plays a central role in any Buddhist moral discussion. It's a term of great semantic complexity and must be handled with care. Most centrally, karma means action. Derivatively, it means the consequences of action. Given the Buddhist commitment to the universality of dependent origination, all action arises from the karmic consequences of past actions, and all action has karmic consequences. Karma is not a cosmic bank account on this view, or a calculus of rewards and punishments in this or some other life. It's an entirely misleading way to think about karma. It's simply the natural causal sequelae of any of our actions, whether they're actions of physical actions, vocal actions, or cognitive actions. Karma accrues to any action simply in virtue of causal interdependence. And karmic consequences include those for oneself and for others, as well as both individual and collective karma. There's nothing mystical about this, there's nothing cosmic about this. This is just the fact that what we do actually has consequences. Think about it for a minute. And what we do is the consequence of other things that have happened to us. Think about that for a minute. Karma is not a crazy doctrine. Buddhist action theory approaches human action and hence ethics in a way slightly divergent from that found in any Western action theory. And it's impossible to understand moral assessment without attention to action theory. Buddhist philosophers distinguish in any action the intention, the act itself, whether it's mental, verbal, or non-verbally physical, and the completion or the final state of affairs resulting directly from the action itself. If I intend to give $10 to care, hand over the $10 to a care worker who then uses it to bribe a policeman, beneficial karma accrues from the intention, beneficial karma from the act, but non-beneficial karma from the completion. If I intend to steal your medicine, but instead pocket the poison that had been placed on your bedstand by your malicious nurse, thereby saving your life, negative karma accrues from the intention, but positive karma from the act and the completion, and so forth. It's just causation, does not reward or punishment here. Note as well that the relevant kinds of karma include the impact on my character and on that of others, as well as the tendency to reinforce or to undermine generosity or malice, and the degree to which action promotes general well-being. There's hence attention both to virtue and to consequence here, and attention to the character of and consequences for anyone affected by actions. We cannot in this framework then ask whether a particular action is good or evil simpliciter, nor can we ask what our obligations or permissions are. Instead, we ask about the states of character reflected by and consequent to our intentions, our words, and our motor acts, and their consequences. The fact that a terrible outcome ensues from a good intention does not make that outcome morally acceptable, nor does a good outcome somehow cancel malicious intent. They're all in play, they all have consequences, they all have explanations. Each component of action has consequences and reflects morally relevant features of its genesis. Motivations that appear to be immoral but prudential are, on a deeper analysis from a Buddhist standpoint, simply confused. There's no kind of nice boundary between the moral and the prudential for this reason, nor is there any limit to the domain of the ethical. Karma is ubiquitous, interdependence is endless, and so responsibility, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama constantly reminds us, can only be thought of as universal. Part 3, virtue, consequence, and obligation. We can now see that Buddhist moral theory is neither purely consequentialist, nor purely archaic, nor purely deontological. Elements of each kind of evaluation are present, but there's no overarching concern for a unified form of moral assessment. Suffering is both caused and constituted by fundamental states of character, including preeminently egocentric attraction, egocentric aversion, and confusion regarding the nature of reality and our place in it. Hence, the cultivation of virtues that undermine these vices is morally desirable. Suffering is perpetuated by our intentions, acts, and consequences. Hence, attention to all of these is necessary for its eradication. Our own happiness and suffering are intimately bound up with those of others. Hence, we're responsible for others and obligated to take their interests into account. But Buddhist ethics is not simply an amalgamation of Aristotle, Mill, and Kant into some kind of incoherent jumble. Instead, it represents a distinct moral framework addressed to problem solving that takes action not to issue from a free will bound by laws, but from a dependently originated, conditioned continuum of causally interdependent psychophysical processes. It takes the relevant consequences of action, not to be pleasure and pain conceived of as introspectable experiences of persons, but to be states of sentient continua of genuine suffering, that to which conduces to suffering, genuine liberation, or that which conduces to genuine liberation, whether or not those happen to be desired or detested or experienced as desirable or detestable by the sentient beings imputed on the basis of those continua. So we're not kind of looking at sensations, experiences, and desires here in a kind of calculus of consequences, but rather looking at suffering in a very broad and very deep sense, and liberation from suffering in a very broad and deep sense when we pay attention to consequences. That's why I say it doesn't look like Western consequentialism. The worst thing you can do is look at Buddhist moral theory and say, this is Western ethics being pursued in a slightly different language. It really is a somewhat different framework for thinking about things, but it's a framework that has something to tell us. The relevant categories of assessment, the relevant considerations in deliberation are unified by a distinct overarching vision of the complexity of ethical life, by a distinct overarching vision of the purpose of moral reflection and moral cultivation, and by a distinct overarching vision of the nature of agency and the nature of life. If we fail to attend to this framework, we see a patchwork. When we attend to the framework, we see a unitary alternative way of taking up moral life. Finally, Buddhist moral theory takes the relevant virtues to be cultivated to be those that conduce to the alleviation of suffering. The adumbration of those virtues begins in the Pali literature, but it's addressed most completely in the Mahayana tradition as developed in such texts as Bodhicharyavatara and Madhyamakavatara. I'm now going to turn to an examination of the Buddhist moral psychology developed in this Mahayana tradition. So part 4, Bodhisattva Path and Buddhist moral psychology. Excuse me. There's nothing special about the suffering of any particular sentient being that gives it pride of place in moral consideration. And this is one of the fundamental insights of Buddhist philosophy. My own suffering doesn't play any special role in my moral calculus, nor does yours, by the way. I hate to break this news to each of you, but rather suffering is a perfectly general phenomenon, and the more you look around the world, the more of it you see, and all of it turns out to matter just as much from a moral point of view. It's an important fact about human beings in particular, but more generally about any beings with sufficient sentience to have moral standing, that their cognitive, affective, and motivational states are linked inextricably with those of indefinitely many others in a vast causal nexus. For present purposes, let's just focus on the case of the social animals we know best, Homo sapiens. Our happiness, suffering, and moral progress depends at all times on the actions and attitudes of others, as well as on their welfare. If others cooperate and support our projects and our development, success is far more likely. If their attitudes are hostile, happiness and progress are both difficult to obtain. If we know of others' weal and woe, we are either motivated to celebrate or to regret. Celebration of others' welfare benefits both ourselves and others. Schadenfreude is not only detrimental to those around us, but ultimately, through undermining the relations that sustain us, to ourselves as well. Similarly, our own actions, mental, verbal, and physical, have endless ramifications, both for our own affective and moral well-being, and for that of those around us. These are just natural facts. This is just, plain old empirical reality. To ignore them is to ignore the nature of action, to the nature of our interdependence, and the relevance of action and causal interdependence to our moral, psychological, and social lives. Confusion regarding, excuse me, I promised you I'd cough. Confusion regarding the nature of reality in the moral realm manifests itself most directly in the grasping of oneself and of that which most immediately pertains to oneself as having special importance and justifiable particular motivational force. In the Buddhist literature, this is referred to as the twofold self-grasping, involving the grasping of I and of being mine, and issues directly in the apparent moral duality of self and other, where somehow my own considerations have more prima facie weight than considerations relevant to somebody else. Such duality is what leads to the apparent distinction between prudential and moral concern that plays such a major role in Western ethical theory and action theory. The distinction between self-regarding and other-regarding acts, and the distinction between those to whom one owes special regard and those to whom one does not. All of these are taken by Buddhist philosophers to be utterly spurious, and in general, to conduce to a view of the world that I always characterize as the world of me et al., a view that's not rationally sustainable once one sees that it's equally available and so equally unjustifiable for any moral subject. This is a point that Bob made very forcefully yesterday. If I try to see the world as kind of J et al., it becomes immediately apparent that everybody else has got the same right to that one, and moral life kind of collapses. It's for this reason at bottom that this kind of fundamental metaphysical confusion is a root moral delusion and not simply an epistemological problem. That's just really important to nail down there. This is a moral problem, not just an epistemological problem from a Buddhist point of view. In the Mahayana, moral attention is focused on the cultivation of a set of perfections or virtues, including those of generosity, patience, propriety, effort, meditation, and wisdom. Once again, this list might seem odd to a Western ethicist in virtue of the inclusion of such prima facie non-moral virtues as those of effort, meditation, and wisdom on the same list as generosity, patience, and propriety. Once again, though, attention to the focus of Buddhist ethics on solving the problem of suffering, and attention to the role of inattention, failure to develop insights and traits of character that are cultivated in meditation, and ignorance of causes and maintainers of suffering, the relevance of all of those to suffering itself should dispel this initial sense of oddness. Excuse me. It's also important to recognize that this Mahayana revolution, as it's sometimes called, it's not really a revolution. It's not an abandonment of the more basic framework of the Eightfold Path, but rather an enrichment and a refocus. The Eightfold Path remains a central guide to the domains in which the perfections figure, and the perfections are manifested in the propensity to perform cognitive, verbal, and physical actions of the kind accessible in the familiar framework of Buddhist action theory. The framework of the perfections hence only represents an approach to morality more focused on states of character than on their manifestations as the fundamental goals of moral practice. The most important innovation in Mahayana moral theory is the instatement of compassion as the central moral value, and the model of the Bodhisattva's compassionate engagement with the world as a moral ideal. Chandrakirti begins his wonderful text, Madhyamaka Avatara, by saying, "A compassionate mind, non-dualistic awareness, and the aspiration for enlightenment are the causes of the Bodhisattvas. However, chief among these is compassion. Like nurturing a seed with water, in time it ripens the causes of the victors, so I praise compassion above all else." The compassionate issue is not a passive emotional response and not a mere desire that everybody kind of be happy. Instead, it's a genuine commitment manifested in thought, speech, and physical action to act for the welfare of all sentient beings. It is in this most sophisticated flowering of Buddhist ethics, with the anticipation of such moral theorists as Hume and Schopenhauer in the West, that Buddhist moral theory makes its closest contact, I think, with Western ethics. Compassion in this tradition is founded on the fundamental insight the Buddha announced in Sarnath, that suffering is bad per se, regardless of whose it is. To fail to take another's suffering as seriously as a motivation for action as one's own is itself a form of suffering and is entirely irrational. Compassion, hence, often, one way of putting this is there's two ways of suffering when somebody else is suffering. Either you can suffer because they're suffering, or you can fail to suffer because they're suffering, in which case you suffer from being an asshole, right? Compassion, hence, is the wellspring of the motivation for the development of all perfections, and the most reliable motivation for morally decent actions. Compassion is also, on this view, the direct result of a genuine appreciation of the emptiness and interdependence of all sentient beings. Once one sees oneself as non-substantial and existing only in interdependence, and once one sees that the happiness and suffering of all sentient beings is entirely causally conditioned, egoism ceases even to be rationally motivated. And the only rational attitude one can adopt towards others is the compassionate one. Chandrakirti continues in this beginning of Madhyamaka Avatara, "I prostrate to this compassion arising for all living beings, who have first generated self-grasping through thinking I, then attachment to things through thinking being mine, so that they're driven around like a water wheel." So the idea is that once you begin to see that the suffering of sentient beings and one's own suffering is driven by the force of this delusion, attachment, and aversion into this kind of endless helplessness, the only rational approach is a desire to alleviate that suffering and its causes. Compassion is the ground of all of the perfections, the enabler of the pursuit of the path. It's fundamental to Mahayana ethics that one cannot adequately cultivate the perfections or pursue the path successfully without a foundation in compassion. Excuse me. This is a point made emphatically by Shantideva and Bodhicharyavatara, as well as in our own time by people like the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, when he asserts that all Buddhism is engaged Buddhism. Now, while the Mahayana schools Let me one more sentence on that. On this view, on the Mahayana view, Buddhist practice can never be a retreat from, but is always a committed, active engagement with the world. So the idea that somehow Buddhist moral practice requires retreat, I think it's fundamentally at odds with everything going on in Mahayana ethics. While the Mahayana schools of Buddhism put special emphasis on the role of compassion in ethics, it's certainly also the case that the Shravaka accounts of Buddhist ethics as well, including those of contemporary engaged Buddhists in the Theravada tradition, including followers of Dr. Ambedkar in India, emphasize the social import of the Four Truths and the social articulation of the Buddhist path. Ambedkar in particular argued that suffering is social in character, that its causes, I'm right there, that its causes are political and economic, that its alleviation requires social action to remove those causes, and that each stage of the Eightfold Path is thoroughly social in nature. Venerable Bhikkhu Buddhadasa in Thailand argues that without social engagement, the Buddhist path makes no sense at all. While some have argued that these interpretations by engaged or socially active Buddhists distort the essentially personal message of the Buddha, it's clear both that this is a reasonable and frequently developed reading of Buddhist ethics, and one that, however socially oriented, retains the fundamental Buddhist ethical outlook. Ethics is about solving a problem. That problem is the pervasiveness of suffering. That suffering is rooted in confusion, attachment, and aversion that fabricates the independent, unique, and especially valuable ego and the special relations of some things to that ego. The solution to that problem on this view, like any other Buddhist view, requires the extirpation of these roots. So whatever your views about Buddhism as personal versus social, when you look at it from this abstract ethical framework, engaged Buddhism is Buddhism. Compassionate engagement requires one to develop upaya, or skillful means, in order to realize these objectives. Compassionate intention is only genuine if it involves a real commitment to action and to the successful completion of action. It's in the domain of upaya that Buddhist and Western ethics converge in practice, and it's in this domain that each can learn from another. So just kind of 2 quick paragraphs about upaya and the junction. Often the best way to ensure that minimal human needs are met, for instance, is to establish rights to basic goods in legal frameworks, to enshrine those rights in our collective moral and political practice. Often the best way to ensure that human dignity is respected is to enshrine values that treat persons as individual bearers of value and to construct constitutions that reflect that. Often the best way to ensure plenty is to develop social welfare policies. And often the best way to develop flourishing citizens is to articulate an education and a robust theory of human virtue. Western moral theorists have been good at each of these things. Liberal democratic theory and a framework of human rights has been a very effective device for the reduction of suffering, though hardly perfect or unproblematic. So has utilitarian social welfare theory. And Aristotelian, Humean, Schopenhauerian virtue theories have been immensely useful in moral education. These Western articulations of the right, the good, and the decent provide a great deal of specific help to anyone seriously engaged in the Bodhisattva path. On the other hand, Buddhist moral theory provides a larger context in which to set these moral programs, and one perhaps more consonant with a plausible metaphysics of personhood and action, and with the genuine complexity of our moral lives. To the extent that our world is characterized by omnipresent suffering, to the extent that that's a real problem, and perhaps the fundamental problem for a morally concerned being, Buddhist moral theory may provide the best way to conceptualize the problem in toto. But Buddhist moral theory and Western moral theory can meet profitably when we ask how to solve that problem in concrete human circumstances. And it's in concrete human circumstances that we live our lives and in which we must solve it. Thank you.